Picture this, an organization so ruthlessly efficient that it controlled entire ports, silenced witnesses before they could open their mouths, and ran black markets that governments couldn't touch even with a decade of trying. An organization whose reach stretched from the docks of New York Harbor all the way into the halls of the Pentagon. An organization that, during some of the most pivotal moments of the 20th century, didn't just coexist with the United States government, it actively saved it. We're talking about the American Mafia, and no cap, the relationship between these two forces is so tangled, so bizarre, and so deeply buried in classified files that most people have never heard the half of it. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 10 of the most mind-bending, jaw-dropping, and frankly unhinged collaborations between organized crime and the US government. Strap in because the tea is scalding. Case 1. Operation Underworld. The Mafia guards the harbor. Imagine a port city gripped by paranoia. It's 1942 and the eastern seaboard of the United States is becoming a graveyard for Allied ships. German U-boats are slipping through American waters like ghosts, sinking tankers and cargo vessels with terrifying precision. Intelligence officers begin to suspect that someone or something is feeding the Nazis critical information about shipping routes. The docks of New York City are crawling with longshoremen who answer to exactly no one in Washington. Nobody moves a crate, a barrel, or a body through those piers without the blessing of one man. That man is Charles Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in Lercara Fredi, Sicily in 1997. His family immigrated to New York when he was 10 years old, landing in the Lower East Side, a neighborhood so economically brutalized that children learned to hustle before they learned to read. His father worked in a sulfur plant, his mother prayed. Neither of those options appealed to young Salvatore. By 14, he was running protection rackets for a few pennies a week, quickly learning that the streets rewarded the bold and devoured the timid. The poverty wasn't just material, it was a kind of soul-crushing humiliation that made a boy choose between invisibility and power. Luciano chose power every single time. He fell into the orbit of Arnold Rothstein, the Jewish gambling kingpin who taught him that crime wasn't about brute force, it was about organization. Luciano took that lesson and weaponized it. Through the Prohibition era, he brokered alliances between Irish, Jewish, and Italian gangs that the old Mustache Pete bosses thought were beneath them. He modernized the mafia, abolished the old Sicilian boss of bosses structure, and created the Commission, a governing board for organized crime in America that functioned with boardroom precision. By the late 1930s, Luciano ran the most powerful criminal organization on the eastern seaboard. Then in 1936, District Attorney Thomas Dewey sent him to prison on a compulsory prostitution charge. Luciano maintained his innocence until his death, and to be honest, historians still argue about it. But his imprisonment didn't end his power, it just relocated it. His empire was built on control, and nowhere was that control more absolute than on the waterfront. His associates ran the longshoremen's unions, which meant they controlled what moved through the docks, who loaded it, and most crucially, who talked about it. Wartime sabotage was rampant. In February 1942, the French luxury liner SS Normandy, which had been seized and was being converted into a troop transport, caught fire in New York Harbor and capsized. The official cause was an accident. Naval intelligence was less certain. Whatever the truth, the Navy knew one thing for certain. They were blind on the docks, and being blind in wartime is the same as being cooked. Commander Charles Radcliffe Haffenden of Naval Intelligence made a decision that would haunt the institutional memory of American law enforcement for decades. He reached out to Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano's right-hand man and the financial genius of the underworld, and proposed a deal. Luciano, rotting in Great Meadow Correctional Facility, would be transferred to more comfortable quarters at Sing Sing and given direct lines of communication to the outside world in exchange for using his network to secure the docks against espionage and to assist with the eventual Allied invasion of Sicily. Luciano delivered. German agents who had been infiltrating dock worker unions were rooted out. Fishermen who ran boats along the coast were recruited as informal lookouts. When the Allies landed in Sicily in 1943, Mafia contacts on the island helped American troops navigate the terrain, identify collaborators, and move with a speed that surprised everyone. After the war, New York Governor Thomas Dewey, the same man who had prosecuted Luciano, commuted his sentence in recognition of his wartime services and deported him to Italy. Luciano spent the rest of his life in Naples, still running business from afar. The legacy? The US government had just proven that when things get desperate enough, no cap, they will absolutely shake hands with the devil, and that precedent would echo for generations. Case 2, the Sicilian Campaign, Mafia Maps and Military Intelligence. Before a single American boot touched the soil of Sicily in July 1943, the island was already being reconquered, not by soldiers, but by whispers. Old men in hilltop villages were being told to expect visitors. Local strongmen were being handed yellow handkerchiefs as signals of safe passage. The most strategically important island in the Mediterranean was being softened up not by bombs, but by the oldest intelligence network in the Western world. Building directly on Operation Underworld, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA, worked with Luciano's contacts to prepare the ground for the Allied invasion of Sicily. The key here is that the Mafia had never really lost its grip on Sicilian rural. The fascist government under Mussolini had brutally suppressed the Sicilian Mafia throughout the 1930s, which meant that by the time the Allies arrived, local mafiosi were highly motivated to assist in the destruction of the regime that had imprisoned and humiliated them. It wasn't charity, it was revenge wrapped in the American flag. Vito Genovese, who would later become one of the most feared bosses in New York, actually served as an interpreter and advisor for the Allied military government in Italy after the invasion. He used the position, of course, to re-establish black market operations and consolidate power, which the Americans eventually figured out and had him arrested. But for a period, a man who would go on to order the murders of dozens of people was on the Allied payroll. If that ain't the most unhinged thing you've heard today, we've only just gotten started. And hey, if this kind of jaw-dropping history is your thing, smash that like button and subscribe right now. Every subscription genuinely keeps this channel going and helps us keep uncovering the stories they don't teach in school. Case 3, the CIA and Sam Giancana, the Castro assassination plots. He ran Chicago with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. He dated a woman simultaneously being pursued by the President of the United States. He ordered murders the way other men ordered lunch. And in 1960, he sat across a table from an agent of the Central Intelligence Agency and agreed to help the United States government kill Fidel Castro. His name was Sam Giancana, and his story is so layered, so packed with betrayal and political intrigue that Hollywood has barely scratched the surface. Born Salvatore Giancana in 1908 in the near west side of Chicago, a neighborhood that functioned as a pressure cooker for immigrant poverty, Giancana was arrested for the first time at the age of 11. His mother had died when he was 2. His father was largely absent. The streets weren't a temptation for young Salvatore, they were a necessity. By his teens, he was running with the 42 Gang, a feeder organization for the Chicago outfit, and he was so recklessly violent that even seasoned criminals found him unnerving. He was, to use a term the young people will appreciate, absolutely unhinged from jump. Giancana caught the attention of the outfit's leadership through a combination of fearlessness and cunning. He became the wheelman for hitmen, then a hitman himself, then a planner of hits, until he had accumulated enough loyalty and enough leverage to ascend to the top of the Chicago outfit in the mid-1950s. Under his leadership, the outfit expanded into Las Vegas, Cuba, and Mexico. He was, in the truest sense, a global crime lord. He also cultivated political connections that blurred lines most people assumed were fixed. He was, by multiple accounts, a major fundraiser for John F. Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign, funneling money and labor union muscle through intermediaries. The relationship between the Kennedys and the mob is its own universe of conspiracy and contradiction, but the CIA plot puts it all into sharp, uncomfortable focus. In 1960, the CIA's security office, working through a former FBI agent named Robert Mayhew, approached Johnny Rosselli, a suave, politically connected mobster who served as the outfit's liaison to Las Vegas, with a proposition: help us kill Castro. The fee discussed was $150,000. Rosselli brought in Giancana and Santos Traficante Jr., the Florida boss with deep ties to pre-revolutionary Cuba. The CIA supplied poison pills, the mob supplied the network. The plan failed, multiple times actually, but the collaboration continued into the early Kennedy administration. The sheer irony here is no cap astronomical. Attorney General Robert Kennedy was simultaneously running the most aggressive federal crackdown on organized crime in American history, while the CIA was literally handing poison to those same criminals and asking for favors. Giancana's empire began to fracture under the relentless pressure of FBI surveillance, ironically intensified by the very Kennedy administration that had indirectly benefited from mob support. He was eventually forced out of Chicago and lived abroad for years. He returned to the U.S. in the mid-1970s and was subpoenaed to testify before the Church Committee, which was investigating CIA assassination plots. He never made it to the witness stand. On June 19, 1975, he was shot 7 times in the basement of his Oak Park home, killed by someone he had apparently trusted enough to share a late-night meal with. The realty? Nobody has ever been charged. His secrets died with him, and the full scope of what he knew about the government's darkest operations remains buried. Case 4. Lansky, Batista, and the intelligence game in Cuba. Meyer Lansky is one of those figures that defies the usual mafia archetypes. No broken nose, no flashy suits, just a small, quiet man with a genius-level financial mind and the emotional temperature of a chess grandmaster. Born in Grodno, then part of the Russian Empire in 1902, Lansky immigrated to New York's Lower East Side as a child, growing up in grinding poverty in a neighborhood where ethnicity determined your enemies and your allies in equal measure. He met Bugsy Siegel as a teenager, and the two formed a partnership that would reshape American crime. Lansky's role in Cuba predates the Cold War paranoia that brought the CIA into the picture. Through the 1940s and 1950s, Lansky had established Havana as the Las Vegas of the Caribbean, investing in casinos with the blessing of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. What most people don't know is that Lansky's casino empire also served as a convenient conduit for intelligence gathering. American intelligence services were deeply interested in Cuba's political situation, and Lansky's network, with its access to politicians, military officers, and business elites across the island, was an invaluable, if unofficial, asset. When the Eisenhower administration began seriously contemplating covert action against the Cuban government in the late 1950s, they weren't starting from zero. They were tapping into infrastructure that the mob had built over a decade. The revolution of 1959 ended both Batista's regime and Lansky's casino empire, but the entanglements between American intelligence and mob-connected Cuban networks continued well into the Kennedy era and beyond. If you're finding all of this absolutely wild, and you should be, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're just getting warmed up, and there's way more where this came from. Case 5. Operation Mongoose and Santos Traficante Jr. Santos Traficante Jr. inherited the Florida mob from his father and transformed it into a sophisticated criminal enterprise with tentacles stretching across the Caribbean. Born in Tampa in 1914 into a Sicilian immigrant family already embedded in organized crime, Traficante Jr. had the rare luxury of learning the business from the inside out before he had to fight for it. He was educated, calm, and extraordinarily patient, qualities that made him both a superior crime boss and a perfect covert asset. After the Cuban Revolution, Traficante had been briefly detained by Castro's government before being released under circumstances that the FBI found deeply suspicious. Some agents theorized he had already made a deal with the new regime. Whether that's true or not, he emerged from Havana with an intimate knowledge of the new Cuban power structure that the CIA desperately wanted. His participation in the CIA's Castro assassination plots under Operation Mongoose, the umbrella program for anti-Castro covert operations, put him at the center of one of the most bizarre public-private partnerships in American history. He attended meetings with CIA handlers, received intelligence briefings, and helped plan operations that, had they been conducted by any other organization, would have been considered straightforward acts of war. Traficante would later be accused by congressional investigators of deliberately sabotaging the CIA plots against Castro, either because he had an arrangement with the Cuban government or because he simply didn't want Castro dead. A living Castro, after all, was a useful bogeyman that kept the CIA focused on Cuba and away from Traficante's actual business. He denied everything, lived to the age of 72, and died of natural causes in 1987, one of the few major mob figures of his era to die peacefully in a hospital bed.
The full truth of what he did and didn't do for the U.S. government remains, to be honest, one of the great unanswered questions of Cold War history.
Case 7. The French Connection and the Corsican Brotherhood. This one requires a little geography. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the ports of Marseille, France were hotbeds of communist labor union activity. The dock workers' unions were affiliated with the French Communist Party and regularly called strikes that disrupted the movement of Marshall Plan goods, American economic aid that was critical to rebuilding Western Europe as a bulwark against Soviet influence. The CIA, running covert operations in France through its newly formed Office of Policy Coordination, needed those strikes broken. The French government was reluctant to use state force against workers. Someone needed to do the dirty work. Enter the Corsican Brotherhood, a criminal network based in Marseille with deep roots in Corsica and a long history of labor violence. The CIA, working through intermediaries and with the tacit knowledge of some French intelligence officials, facilitated the Brotherhood's efforts to physically intimidate, assault, and drive out communist union organizers from the Marseille docks. The Corsicans broke the strikes. In exchange, they received protection from French law enforcement for their existing criminal operations, which happened to include the heroin trade. Here is where things get truly cooked. The same CIA operation that broke the communist unions also, inadvertently, or perhaps not so inadvertently, enabled the establishment of the French Connection heroin network, which would go on to flood American cities with narcotics throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The smack that destroyed families in Harlem and Detroit had at its origin point the fingerprints of an American intelligence agency trying to win the Cold War. The chickens, as they say, came home to roost. Case 7. The Teamsters, Jimmy Hoffa, and the FBI's complicated dance. James Riddle Hoffa is not, strictly speaking, a mafia figure, but the International Brotherhood of Teamsters under his leadership was so deeply intertwined with organized crime and so simultaneously useful to federal agencies pursuing other targets that his story belongs here absolutely. Hoffa was born in 1913 in Brazil, Indiana, to a coal miner father who died of work-related illness when Jimmy was 7. Poverty came fast and hard. By his early 20s, he was a union organizer in Detroit, and he discovered early that the mob's muscle could be weaponized for labor organizing just as effectively as it could be for criminal enterprise. Through the 1950s, the Teamster Pension Fund became what investigators called the mob's bank. Hundreds of millions of dollars in worker retirement savings were loaned out to organized crime figures to build Las Vegas casinos and fund criminal enterprises across the country. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, was intensely interested in this arrangement. But here's where the story gets layered. Hoover was simultaneously a fierce opponent of organized crime and deeply reluctant to acknowledge its existence as a national phenomenon for reasons that remain contested among historians. The Bureau's relationship with Teamster informants, people embedded in Hoffa's organization who were feeding information to federal agents, created a situation where the government was, in effect, running sources inside an organization it was simultaneously investigating. Information flowed in both directions, and not always in ways that served justice. Hoffa disappeared on July 30th, 1975, presumably murdered, his body never found. The circumstances of his death connect, by many accounts, to mob figures who had long since calculated that his usefulness had expired. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep going down this rabbit hole. There are more stories like this than you could possibly imagine, and we've got them all lined up for you. Seriously, hit that subscribe button. It means everything.
Case 8. Whitey Bulger and the FBI, when the informant becomes the monster. He was one of the most feared criminals in New England for 3 decades. He ran South Boston with a combination of charm, paranoia, and breathtaking violence. He murdered at least 19 people. He was also, for years, the FBI's most prized informant, protected by agents who looked the other way while he committed murders they should have been investigating. His name was James Joseph Bulger, and the story of what the federal government allowed him to do and what it did in return is perhaps the most disturbing entry on this entire list. Whitey Bulger was born in 1929 in Dorchester, Massachusetts, and grew up in the Old Harbor Public Housing Project in South Boston, a world defined by Irish Catholic working-class culture, deep neighborhood loyalty, and a bone-deep suspicion of outsiders. He was one of 6 children. His father had lost an arm in an industrial accident. The family was poor in the specific way that public housing poor is: technically sheltered, functionally desperate. Bulger was arrested for the first time as a teenager and spent time in reform school, then in Alcatraz and Atlanta Federal Penitentiary after a string of bank robberies in his 20s. Prison did not rehabilitate him, it educated him. When Bulger returned to South Boston in the early 1960s, he embedded himself in the Winter Hill Gang and began the slow, patient climb toward the top. He was calculating in a way that distinguished him from the merely violent. He understood that power wasn't just about who you could threaten, it was about who you could befriend. He cultivated relationships with politicians, police officers, and, fatefully, FBI agents. His younger brother, William Bulger, was simultaneously rising through Massachusetts state politics, eventually becoming president of the Massachusetts Senate, a connection that provided both cover and cachet. By the late 1970s, Whitey Bulger was one of 2 or 3 most powerful criminal figures in New England. The murders attributed to Bulger span 2 decades and include some of the most cold-blooded acts recorded in New England criminal history. He killed rivals, witnesses, and on at least 2 occasions, women, including Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey, whose deaths he later admitted to with a chilling lack of remorse. He extorted bookmakers and drug dealers, not by threatening their lives, but by making it clear that refusal would result in exactly that. His method of control was total and personal. He wanted people to fear him specifically, not just the organization. That specificity of terror was, in a grotesque way, his brand. The corruption at the heart of this story centers on FBI agent John Connolly, who had grown up in South Boston and maintained a childhood admiration for Bulger that curdled into criminal complicity. Connolly recruited Bulger as an informant in 1975, ostensibly to use him against the New England Italian mob. What followed was a catastrophic inversion of justice. Connolly and at least 1 supervisory agent tipped Bulger off to FBI investigations, revealed the identities of informants who were subsequently murdered, and helped Bulger eliminate rivals who threatened his criminal supremacy. The FBI, in effect, was running one criminal enterprise for the purpose of destroying another, while the enterprise they were running committed murder after murder with federal protection. That's not just cooked, that's scorched. Bulger was finally indicted in 1994 and, tipped off by Connolly, fled before he could be arrested. He spent 16 years as a fugitive, living in Santa Monica, California under an assumed identity. He was captured in 2011, convicted of 11 murders, and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. He was beaten to death in federal prison in 2018 at the age of 89 by fellow inmates with mob connections, a death so fitting in its irony that it seemed scripted. Connolly was convicted of racketeering and murder and died in prison in 2023. The legacy of the Bulger case forced a sweeping overhaul of FBI informant protocols and remains the starkest example on record of what happens when the government climbs into bed with organized crime and loses track of who's in charge. Case 9. The Colombian Drug Wars and the DEA's Uncomfortable Alliances. The early 1980s and 1990s saw the American government engage in a series of increasingly desperate tactical arrangements in its war against the Colombian cocaine cartels. This is less a story about the Italian-American Mafia and more about the broader pattern of law enforcement agencies working with criminals to catch bigger criminals, a pattern the Mafia collaborations established and that has never really gone away. Informants within the Medellin and Cali cartels were given extraordinary latitude to continue their criminal operations in exchange for intelligence. Some were allowed to continue trafficking drugs, in smaller quantities technically, though that distinction was cold comfort to the communities absorbing those drugs. The DEA's relationship with informants in this era produced results that were genuinely mixed. Major cartel figures were arrested, but the intelligence infrastructure also produced cases of what investigators called protection for profit.
informants using their DEA connections as a shield while expanding their own operations. The case of Carlos Leather, one of the founding members of the Medellin cartel, is instructive. He ultimately cooperated with American prosecutors against Manuel Noriega of Panama, receiving a sentence reduction in exchange. The U.S. government used a cocaine trafficker as a witness to prosecute a foreign head of state. The precedent set by Lucky Luciano, criminal cooperation in exchange for government benefits, had gone fully global.
And now we arrive at the final, most unsettling truth of everything we've discussed today. Because the 10 cases in this documentary are not anomalies. They are not embarrassing footnotes to an otherwise clean record. They are, to be honest, symptoms of a structural reality that governments operating in the shadows of the Cold War, the War on Terror, and every other existential crisis found organized crime not just useful, but sometimes essential. And the Mafia, for its part, understood this perfectly. Look at the through line connecting Operation Underworld to the CIA's Castro plots to Whitey Bulger's protected reign. In each case, the government needed something it couldn't obtain through legitimate means: dockside security, foreign intelligence, criminal informants, and organized crime had it. The transaction always came with a cost that was paid not by the officials who made the deal, but by the communities where the crime was allowed to flourish. The neighborhoods where heroin arrived because of French Connection protection. The families of the people Bulger murdered while FBI agents looked the other way. The witnesses who were killed because a federal agent was loyal to a childhood memory rather than the badge. What's the lasting takeaway from all of this? No cap, it's complicated. Some of these collaborations produced genuine strategic results. The security of American ports in wartime almost certainly saved lives. The intelligence gathered through mob networks in Cuba and Italy may have prevented conflicts that could have escalated catastrophically. But those results don't erase the cost. They don't resurrect the people who were murdered under federal protection. They don't unflood the neighborhoods that were drowned in narcotics while the government's attention was pointed elsewhere. The Mafia understood power the way very few institutions do, as a transaction, always, with terms that must be enforced. The government, when it sat down at that table, consistently believed it was the senior partner. History suggests the arrangement was considerably more equal than anyone in Washington was comfortable admitting. And that discomfort, that institutional unwillingness to reckon fully with what was done and why, is why so many of these stories remained classified, buried in redacted files, or simply never prosecuted for decades after the fact. Lucky Luciano died in Naples, Italy in 1962 of a heart attack, reportedly at the airport where he was meeting a film producer interested in his life story. The story never got made. Sam Giancana died in his basement with 7 bullets in him and his secrets intact. Meyer Lansky outlived almost everyone, dying quietly in Miami in 1983, remarkably having never served significant federal prison time despite being one of the most important figures in American organized crime for half a century. Whitey Bulger, who trusted the FBI enough to let them know his enemies' names, was beaten to death by men whose organization those enemies had belonged to. There is a kind of dark, cyclical justice in that if you squint at it the right way. The Mafia and the US government are not, in the final analysis, opposites. They are, at their structural cores, both organizations built on the exercise of power, the enforcement of loyalty, and the management of information. When they worked together, they were formidably effective. When they worked against each other, the results were less predictable. And when the lines between them blurred entirely, as in the case of the FBI and Whitey Bulger, the result was something that no official could fully explain, that no headline could fully capture, and that the people most damaged by it could never fully escape. The tea, when you pour it all out, is this: power doesn't respect labels. It doesn't care whether the organization using it has a badge or a Sicilian handshake. It flows where the leverage is. And for a significant portion of the 20th century, some of the most important leverage in the world belonged to men who ran their operations out of social clubs and back rooms and waterfront warehouses. Men who had started life with nothing in tenements in Palermo and Dorchester and the Lower East Side, and who had built something that the most powerful government on earth occasionally found itself unable to function without. That is the true crime.
Not the murders, though those were real and terrible. The true crime is the systemic corruption of accountability that these arrangements produced. The way they taught institutions to treat law as a resource to be managed rather than a principle to be honored. And that crime, unlike the men who committed it, has no expiration date. If you made it all the way to the end of this documentary, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Seriously, the fact that you're still here means you care about real history, the messy kind, the kind that doesn't get a clean resolution or a tidy moral. Please like this video if it gave you something to think about, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. We have more stories like this, darker, stranger, more unbelievable, and every subscriber tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling matters. Hit the bell notification so you're always first. And if you've got a story you think we should cover, drop it in the comments. The community here is incredible, and we read every single one. The truth is always stranger than fiction, and we're just getting started.